A trailblazer in the study of brain health and an advocate for quality end-of-life care. Dr. Charles Bernick and Stephanie Castellone are our guests this week on Nevada Week in Person Extra.
Support for Nevada Week in Person is provided by Senator William H. Hernstadt.
Welcome to Nevada Week in Person Extra. I'm Amber Renee Dixon. Stephanie Castellone is a contortionist, registered nurse, end-of-life doula, and nonprofit CEO. We'll show you how all her roles are connected in a bit. But first, Dr. Charles Bernick's involvement in the research and treatment of Alzheimer's disease spans more than 30 years. The past 15 of them, he's served as a staff neurologist at the Cleveland Clinic Lou Ruvo Center for Brain Health. That's where we met up with Dr. Bernick and learned what drives him to do this work. You are like so many Las Vegans in that you are originally from Los Angeles.
Yes, yeah.
1994, though, is what brings you to Nevada. What brings you here, and with what hopes and dreams?
Yeah, I think I'm like a lot of Las Vegans. That is, I came here for opportunity. I was in Sacramento before coming here, but was ready to make a move. And my interest is in Alzheimer's disease, and at that time there really wasn't much in this city, in fact in this whole state. And so I felt that it was really an opportunity to build something, from the ground up, and it's been a project ever since.
Kind of a daunting task.
Yes, but what's really interesting, Amber, is that the city, the support of everybody who really kind of come together if there's a cause or if there's an initiative. And it's like a lot of things. I mean, it's really who you work with and the support that you get that makes things happen. And that was here in Nevada.
You found that?
Absolutely.
Your goal at the time when moving here, as you said in a UNLV article, was to develop a statewide system of Alzheimer's research and care. How did you go about doing that?
Well, it began actually here in Las Vegas. So we got together the people we need, social workers, help with clinical research, research assistants, things like that. And then we felt that we had the opportunity to really branch out throughout the state. So we developed a clinic actually in Reno. And through telehealth, and this is what, 20 years ago, before COVID, Nevada really had a very strong infrastructure for telehealth. And so we had clinics set up in Elko, in Ely, in Winnemucca. And so we were really able to cover the whole state through telemedicine, which was at that time pretty novel.
Well, I mentioned Trailblazer in the intro, and I think that is an example of how you helped implement something that was, now so common, but back then, not really. What was it that sparked your interest in Alzheimer's research in particular?
Well, this dates back even further. So when I was finishing some of my training, I had a job, like a moonlighting job, at what we now call a memory care unit, so in a nursing home. And so I had to quickly learn about Alzheimer's disease. But what it turned out, there wasn't much on Alzheimer's disease then. This is 1984. And so it really became kind of an interest of mine in this field because we really, again, had the opportunity to take a disease that nobody really knew much about, but yet affected so many people, and try to really learn about it, develop therapies, treatments, and not really only for the patient, but of course for the families as well.
What was treatment like back then, the state of medical care for someone with Alzheimer's?
I can answer that very simply. Zero. There were no treatments. So at that time, 1985, there were no specific treatments for Alzheimer's disease. And really the care was just supportive, treating symptoms, and we've come a long way.
Treating symptoms, the support. I imagine even back then there was not a lot known about what caregivers need to be doing.
No, there wasn't, and I think that's evolved over time. It's one of the things we're proud of here at the Cleveland Clinic, because that's really part of the equation. If you can't just treat the patient, that's half of the equation. The other part is really the family, the caregivers. They and sometimes really bear more of the burden than the patient themselves.
Can you point to areas of education for caregivers that are so crucial?
Yeah, well, I think it's just getting information, talking with peers. That's why support groups are so important. Learning tech. Sometimes when I go to the support groups, I learn new things about
Really?
kind of what people figured out on how to deal with behaviors or situations or travel. So I think it's really just getting engaged, trying to find the resources, and hopefully again a center like ours can help to help people in dealing with that task.
Is there an example you could give me of a time when you've been working with a patient whose behavior is perhaps preventing you from doing what you need to do or what you need to find out?
Yeah, it happens a lot. I mean, but because sometimes patients, as part of the disease, don't have insight into the illness. They may resist some of the things you're trying to do, some of the things the caregivers are doing. It's extremely frustrating. But I think through learning techniques, medications if necessary, most of those things can be really handled now. I had kind of a personal experience. My mother had Alzheimer's disease, and even in somebody who should know everything about this, it's a challenge. It's a challenge anytime you're a caregiver.
I wondered when I was going to ask you about what inspired you to get into this field, if it was going to be a person, but it initially was that job that you had. At what point did you find out that your mother had Alzheimer's?
Well, she developed it at least symptomatically in her mid-80s, so this was probably around 2010, something like that. And I think, she had a good life. She made it to 96. So having the disease itself doesn't mean your life ends. But again, it's a hard road, and it's difficult for caregivers.
I imagine that gives you a lot of insight. I mean, how powerful to have had that experience in your own life.
Yeah, you never know until you walk in those shoes, right? I mean, so you may think you know what's best for a person or for a patient, but until you're in that situation, you really probably don't know. So I think it did give me perspective and give me insight into kind of what people are going through.
What did your mom think of the line of work you chose?
Yeah, I think, well, of course, at the time I started, she wasn't really affected, and I think she was just proud that I had a job, I was doing something. But yeah, as I think when she had the disease, she was one that really didn't have a lot of insight, so she thought it was just aging, and it was fine, and she was just very happy and pleasant, and that's probably the best you can hope for.
Would it have helped for her to have been aware?
I don't think so. I think in some sense it's almost more frustrating, but you see it in different situations. So it's not, with Alzheimer's disease, it's just not one size fit all. There's different, some people are very happily demented during their course. Some people become more agitated and change their personality, and there's just no really rhyme or reason of it. So as far as in treating that, you just try to improve really the quality of that person's life.
Talking about some of the advancements, I read a New York Times article ahead of this, the first line of which was, quote, "Over the last 3 years, a new class of Alzheimer's drug, the first to treat a root cause of the disease, has set off a roller coaster of hope and disappointment." Where have you been on that roller coaster, or have you even been on it?
Well, I'm on the hope side. I mean, the disappointment, I think it's only disappointing if you have unrealistic expectations. I think having been in this field for over 30 years, it's probably the biggest advance that we've had. And so, yeah, it's not a cure. These new drugs, lecanemab, and there's another one that's coming out probably later this year. These aren't cures, but we do believe they can slow the trajectory of the disease. Here at the Cleveland Clinic, we're involved in a prevention study, actually trying to prevent Alzheimer's disease, which I think people are hopeful about. So I think there's a lot of hope in the field, as long as you have realistic expectations of what some of these drugs can do.
How do you handle the valleys? There are the peaks, and then there are the valleys. How do you handle those?
Yeah, I think it's like everything in life. I mean, you do the best you can. I think even in difficult times, there are things you can do. So there's always things you can do, and I'm not one to believe that this is your diagnosis and then things end. I think again a person can have an enjoyable and productive life, even with a disease like Alzheimer's disease.
That study, you are in year what of 5? It's a 5-year study?
Yes, it's just wrapping up enrollment now, so it's still going to be another 5 years before we get the results, but we'll get those results, and I think they're going to hopefully change our approach to treating Alzheimer's disease.
What is its hypothesis, and if it's true, what will the impact be?
Yeah, the idea is that we actually can recognize the disease process 7 to 10 years before you have symptoms. So we have tools to do that. So the idea of the study is that we take people who are not having any symptoms, who are normal, but who have evidence of the disease starting, and treating them at that time with some of these drugs that remove the protein that builds up in Alzheimer's disease called amyloid. So the thought is if you can take it away, pull it out of the brain early before it causes damage, you can prevent the disease, or at least prevent the more advanced stages of the disease. So I think it's a hopeful hypothesis. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we'll be successful, but we'll have to see.
All right, that could be a career-defining moment for you, I imagine.
That would be certainly exciting, that's for sure. And I might be the first patient to take it. I don't know. We'll see.
What about the professional fighters' brain health study? That has to be something significant in your career as well. You've been working on that how many years now?
Yeah, we started that. Well, the study started in 2011. We probably started planning it a little earlier than that. It's somewhat similar to the situation when I got involved in Alzheimer's. That is, this other condition, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And this is what you hear about in some of the professional athletes, football players who have had some tragic deaths because of it. There's more attention coming out about it in the early 2000s. And we felt that we were in a position to try to learn more about this condition. So we started a study here in Las Vegas, really the first of its kind, that was to follow individuals who were exposed to repetitive head impacts. Now, we happened at that time to choose fighters, so boxers, MMA fighters, because we're the fight capital of the world. We, again, have this tremendous support from the community, from the UFC, from Top Rank Boxing, from our Nevada Athletic Commission, who really made this a feasible project. So we've been following fighters and now other athletes 13 years now.
And so CTE, you can't diagnose it until after someone has passed, but how are you monitoring their brains then? I mean, what are you looking for when you are watching these fighters?
So we have a lot of measures we look at. We look at blood measures of inflammation in the brain. We do brain imaging every other year. They get speech samples. We test their cognitive function. So we get a lot of information about how they're really doing. And the goal is to develop a test that we are confident in that can diagnose CTE before death, while somebody still has it, and particularly diagnose it early, with the same hope as with Alzheimer's disease, that you can treat it early and potentially prevent long-term consequences.
What was that like getting into this, when I imagine there are other neurologists who are like, boxing and MMA, they shouldn't even exist as a sport? And then what about the people who don't believe that CTE is caused by contact sports?
Well, I would challenge those people, but I think as far as, studying sports like boxing and MMA, they've been around forever. Well, maybe not MMA, but I mean, boxing's been around forever. It's not going to go away. I think you could say the same thing about football, for that matter. In fact, there may be more or harder impacts if you make it up to the professional football level. So we don't make really any judgments about the sport itself. Our interest is really, how do we make these things safer? How do we detect changes early? What are the risk factors? What can we advise athletes and really empower them to make decisions on their own health?
Dr. Charles Bernick, thank you so much for joining Nevada Week in Person.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Using her experience as a circus performer and hospice nurse, Stephanie Castellone started a unique nonprofit helping senior variety show performers. Stephanie Castellone shared why she was so passionate about helping these talented seniors on Nevada Week in Person in August 2023. So BurlyCares, Burly being short for burlesque.
Yes.
What happened that made you say, this kind of nonprofit is needed in Las Vegas?
I honestly think it was a slowing down during the pandemic when everything shut down. I became closer with some of the burlesque, we call them legends or senior performers in town during that time. One in particular was in the dying process, not due to COVID, but just from natural, disease processes, who I had known for a really long time, and we had a pretty close relationship. And she was the one to really actually school me in that this is very much a need. This is a whole population of people. And she goes, I know you know, but like, this is a population that's going to need help very much so in the next, few years. And she was very much correct.
So in what ways are they needing help?
From anything from fundraising for basic life necessities to assistance, like, minor assistance in the house with maybe some chores or errands. But really, by and large, as someone declines, this population very much is in need of assistance with declining because they're so used to being physical all the time and being performers and being on. And so as they're declining in the natural, process of life and with the human body, having somebody like BurlyCares or an organization like BurlyCares is phenomenal for them to kind of really hold their hand and say, it's going to be okay. We're going to get through this together and you're not going to be alone.
And you're specifically, I think, talking about the end-of-life doula services that you provide. What is an end-of-life doula?
End-of-life doula is very similar to a hospice volunteer. In fact, my specialty in nursing for many years is hospice. And so when end-of-life doula came on the map as a term, it was funny because I just had to take a step back. I said, wait, that's a hospice volunteer. We used to have a division of volunteers. Each hospice has to have one. So when the term came out, I thought, okay, but this is really nice because at least it's giving a terminology to a very needed part of hospice, which is volunteer services. But the end-of-life doulas do a little bit more and more comprehensive in that they're there for the family. They'll say to the family member, you know what, why don't you go take a nap? You can set your alarm. I'll be here with your loved one, and then you get some rest. That's the sort of thing that's more concise than a volunteer in hospice might come in, spend a little bit of time, read a book, and then leave. But with an end-of-life death doula, it's a little bit more concise. There's a little bit more of, like, I would say, a care plan in place for that person in what they're doing specifically with the patient.
To help a person to
help the person.
Well, you told Las Vegas Weekly that you have found a, quote, profound love with helping people pass.
Yes.
What is it about that process that's drawn you so much?
It's very much my belief that one of the best things and one of the most honorable and amazing things you can do is to bring someone home. And by home, I mean the home, the proverbial, the real home, as I say it. It's an honor. It's very similar to a birth, and it's my belief that it's not the end at all, and it's very much a transition. So it's an honor. It's an absolute honor.
And there are birthing doulas.
Yes.
Right. So
absolutely.
This is, that's the start of life. This is
which I've done a few times as well.
Okay. Another talent that you have.
I wouldn't say I am by any means proficient, but I've helped a few friends with birthing, yes.
You talked about the proverbial home, and I'm wondering, when you think about starting BurlyCares, is there anyone better than you to have started this? Do you believe in destiny?
Very much so. And it was really ironic as it was coming to fruition with that legend in particular that I spoke about. There was a moment where it really did hit me, and she said it as well. She's like, sweetheart, who else better? I mean, you have 20 plus years experience. There's no one else in the community that has 20 plus years, specifically in hospice, and so I thought about it. She's very much correct. And this is very much destiny because what was happening in my own life at the time was very much in congruence with, yes, I can do this now, especially with things being shut down.
Yeah, so it allowed you that time.
That time.
I think some viewers might be wondering, well, why these performers versus just older adults in general? Why might they need this service more than others?
It's a good question. Our population is most of us are very much extroverts, and we love to be with people, and we love to entertain, and we love to keep socialization is very important for this population. I would say much more than the average person. Most of us thrive on each other and being together. And so if they don't have that in place as they're declining, it becomes much more of an issue, and it even plays into increased pain, increased anxiety for sure, increased depression. So if things like an end-of-life doula is in place, or a community of people are in place, or as I call my team for each kind of individual legend, that really decreases the amount of anxiety, depression, and pain.
Wow, and that is for the end of life, but also you're providing services to combat isolation.
Yes.
While these legends are still active.
Yes, absolutely.
How so?
We do. We host several different things in the community. We put on shows because that's what we do.
Yeah.
So we're all pretty proficient in that. And we try to do that at least once a quarter, like once every 3 months, 3 or 4 months, to make sure that we're with them, people are coming together. It was much more difficult, of course, during COVID, but we still made it work in a way that was safe for everybody. So,
I want to talk specifically about being a contortionist.
Yeah,
I'm fascinated by how someone ends up becoming a contortionist. What was your path?
well, my path was very different. Most contortionists come from a circus family or a circus background. I did come from a circus background, but not a circus family. I'm first generation, as they would say. But I took sports acrobatics as a child, starting at 6. And what we were doing was contortion, but where I lived and grew up, that term didn't exist. That wasn't a term that was used on a regular. And so we called it sports acrobatics. And I was in a competitive team from a very young age and did that all the way through pretty much almost to high school. So my joints and ligaments and muscles were already trained for it. And so I took some time off because I went to college, became a nurse. When I went right back into it because I knew that that was what was missing in my life. I got very lucky.
You're from Rhode Island.
I'm from Rhode Island.
And you moved here because of circus.
Yes.
So prior to moving here, had you done that Mongolian form?
No.
No.
Not at all.
Wow.
That was when I came here in 2004, and I didn't start with them until about 2007.
So you really went out on a limb,
Yes.
no pun intended.
Yeah, absolutely.
What-
Wing and a prayer.
What drove you to do that?
Now, there's a lot of different factors, I think. I do believe that there was very much something spiritual. There was very much something during that time. I distinctively remember I was very into and had a very regular yoga practice. And if you've ever practiced yoga, it's very powerful, and I love it to this day. And I still try to practice as much as I can, although my contortion has kind of become my yoga practice in many ways. But while I was doing that, I was very in touch, and there was energy that I was feeling that was very different than what I felt before, and it was a very knowing of, nope, this is where we're going. And I knew on some level that I was going to make it work, and that this was what I needed to do. And I had never felt anything that rich and deep before, so I knew we got to at least try.
How lucky to have.
Very lucky. Yeah, incredibly lucky.
And so going with that, you end up going on to perform for or work for artists like Jay-Z and Beyonce. But what do you mean by that? Do you perform for them or perform with them?
That's an amazing story. So I do a lot of corporate events, and I've done a lot of corporate events. And we were down at Lake Las Vegas, and I was working with one of my agents that I usually do gigs with. And we're in the room, we're warming up. There's me, there's a couple of rhythmic dancers, there's another hand balancer person. We're all, together, we know each other, everything. All of a sudden, one of the girls comes back, she goes, she's right in the front. And I went, she's right in the front, who? She goes, Beyonce. And I went, Beyonce's here? And then one of the other people said, oh, that's this whole event. This is a private event for Beyonce and Jay-Z's Roca Wear. And I went, my jaw dropped. And I was like, no one told me this. And so I walk out to do my act, and there they are, right there. And I'm like,
You didn't wave?
No.
Okay.
Afterwards, I shook their hand, and I was very much very nice to meet you. Thank you for having me. They loved everything. So it was a beautiful evening.
Now, she has her own, I guess, what does she call it? Like another personality, her stage personality, which you do as well.
Yes.
You're Ms. Charlemagne.
I am.
How did you come upon that, and what is your persona like?
Miss Charlemagne is my burlesque persona. Back in about between 2008 and 2009, I met another girl in town who was performing, who was also a nurse, who was the proverbial person who brought what we call neo-burlesque kind of to Vegas. Because prior to that, there was kind of a lapse in what is burlesque, right? Because you had the golden era, and then we have this new era, which we call neo.
Okay.
So there was another performer in town who I got friendly with because she was a nurse, and we did a lot of shows together. And she was the one who very much encouraged me, like, no, you should do this art form. It's so much fun. And she was very much right, because burlesque is one of those art forms that is very, you can make it very rich and add it from the beginning, you know, edit your own music, do your own costume, have your own name and persona. Miss Charlemagne comes from, Charla was the woman who taught me hospice. And she was my manager for 6 years until she passed. And what's ironic about Charla is Charla was actually one of the first people to tell me about burlesque before I even met the girl that I worked with. She goes, have you seen these shows? They're called burlesque shows, and I saw one the other night, and you would love it. Because she knew I was a performer, right, that I moved here to perform. And she was always so supportive of me being the performer, you know, as well as teaching me hospice, which she was so phenomenal at. And she introduced me to burlesque. And so I remember as she was passing and I was getting more into burlesque, I said to my husband, I said, I think my name needs to have Charla in it somehow. And he was like, oh, that would be kind of cool. And so her full name was Charla Jo Paul. That was her full name. And so I thought Charla Jo was like, how am I going to make a name with Charla Jo? And Charlemagne just kind of came to me, and it stuck. And then I just put the Ms. to it, you know. So
What a beautiful way to honor her.
yes.
Stephanie Castellone, thank
Yeah.
you so much for
Thank you
joining
very
Nevada
much.
Week in person. To see more interviews like this, go to vegaspbs.org/Nevada Week.